Okay, so I want to explain to you operant conditioning, especially positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, because as basic as that stuff seems, it can be kind of confusing to students. And just like in classical conditioning, you had to identify different parts of the classical conditioning scenarios, you're going to have to identify different parts of operant conditioning scenarios as well. So we are going to practice that in the next couple of days here. But first, I want to explain in my own words what all of this stuff is about with operant conditioning. So first off, operant conditioning remember, conditioning means learning, so it's operant learning. But operant conditioning is a change in behavior caused by reinforcements or punishments. And the reason why I put that it is a voluntary response is because this is what distinguishes it from classical conditioning. If you remember, classical conditioning causes an involuntary or automatic body response we cannot control if and when we are classically conditioned. Technically, even though operant conditioning is highly effective and it is used every day of our lives without us even knowing it, it is technically voluntary, and somebody could control whether or not they are operantly conditioned. Okay, so a couple of things that you need to know. Picture of this guy on the screen. I always laugh when I see him because he's got really funny hair, but his name's B.F. Skinner. He, just like Ivan Pavlov, is an extremely famous name in the world of psychology. He is the guy that did all of the research in the beginning on operant conditioning in the mid 1900s. He created what's known as an operant chamber, or more commonly referred to as a Skinner box. Basically, he did all of his research on rats and pigeons, and he would put them into an apparatus, as you see on the bottom right part of your screen, where if it were a rat, there is a bar that they could press, usually referred to as a lever, and when they would press it, food would be dispensed, which would then cause them to press the bar again because they would want more food. So basically, he increased the behavior, or taught the rat and pigeon to press a lever by reinforcing them with the food, which is a big motivator to non-human animals. Okay, so that's what he did his research on. In the case of Skinner boxes with pigeons, there wasn't a bar, there was like a button that they had to peck at because pigeons would have a hard time pressing a bar. Okay, anyway, let's keep going. Okay, so in operant conditioning, there are ways to increase behavior and there are ways to decrease behavior. The first table here that I've put up, there's going to be another one in a second. This looks like a lot of stuff, but this is a nice summary of what you need to know. You can have two types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. A reinforcement is anything that causes a behavior to increase. In operant conditioning, it's very important for you to remember and understand that positive and negative do not mean good and bad. So oftentimes in our day-to-day language, we use the words positive and negative to refer to good and bad. This just means something is either added or subtracted, or in the case of the description, it says add a desirable stimulus or remove an aversive, which means undesirable stimulus. Okay, so again, I'm going to repeat this because it's super important. Reinforcements increase behaviors. Positive reinforcements are when a behavior is increased because you've added a desirable stimulus, which is called a consequence. A consequence is a thing that causes a behavior to increase or decrease. And then a negative reinforcement is when a behavior increases because you've taken away or subtracted an undesirable stimulus. So, for example, in positive reinforcement, if giving somebody a hug, which would be that person is getting something or you're adding something to that person, causes them to do something more often, like say, this is a weird example, but say you do something good in school and I go, that's awesome. And I give you a big hug and that makes you feel so good that you continue to do that good thing in school. That is a positive reinforcement because I've increased your behavior by adding something, which is the hug. Receiving a paycheck. If anybody works who's listening to me, I work, I'm a teacher, I get paid every other Friday. That causes me to continue working and to increase my behavior of teaching. So there's a positive reinforcement. Okay, so when you get in your vehicles and say you choose to not put on your seatbelt, what happens? Well, you hear this annoying beep, right? And that beep continues until you put your seatbelt on. The reason why that's negative reinforcement is because you put your seatbelt on more often to eliminate the undesirable stimulus of the loud noise. So car designers and engineers specifically know that negative reinforcement is a highly effective method of behavior change. And so they specifically use negative reinforcement to get people to hopefully wear their seatbelts more often. Okay, so punishments then. Punishments are ways to decrease a behavior. And remember that positive and negative don't mean good and bad. So the idea of a positive punishment sounds kind of funny to us, but it doesn't mean good punishment and bad punishment. It means a consequence is added and it causes a behavior to decrease, or a consequence is taken away, which causes a behavior to decrease. So remember in this case too, aversive means undesirable or unwanted. So say in the example of a spanking, I got a story. When I was a kid, my mom told me, if you color on the walls one more time, I'm going to spank you. Well, I don't remember this, but apparently I took a purple marker in the corner of the wall and reached up as high as I could all the way to the floor, and I drew on the walls. And so I therefore got a spanking, and I never colored on the walls again after that. And so the reason why it's considered positive punishment is because the consequence was the spanking. That's the thing that caused the behavior to change. It was added. It was applied to me. And then my behavior decreased because of it. The behavior that decreased was the coloring on the walls. In the case of negative punishment, I'm going to use my own example. Say you have a curfew and your curfew is midnight and you come home past your curfew. Your parents may use negative punishment by taking away your cell phone so that you no longer come in past curfew. So that would be a negative punishment because the punishment is you come in past curfew less often. The negative component is you got your phone taken away. So you've subtracted, or in this case, withdrawn a desirable stimulus. Okay? This may sound confusing, but we're going to go through some examples. There's a lot on this slide. In summary, in operant conditioning, if a behavior increases, it's an example of reinforcement. If a behavior decreases, it is an example of punishment. If a consequence is added, it's positive. If a consequence is subtracted, it is negative. Here's a practice example for you. Finnegan, your cat, has begun to bite more frequently. You read that if you squirt him with water from a spray bottle, he will learn not to repeat that behavior. You decide to try it out, and Finnegan no longer bites you. Does the behavior in the end increase or decrease? Well, it says he no longer bites you, and in the beginning he did bite you. So it's decreasing. It is therefore a punishment. What's the consequence? The consequence is being squirted with water, specifically squirting Finnegan with water. Is the consequence, or the thing that changes the behavior, added or subtracted? The thing that causes the behavior to change, added or subtracted? It's added. The water is being added or applied to him. So this is an example of positive punishment. Okay? The punishment is because his behavior has changed in the end and it is weakened or decreasing. And positive because you're applying or adding the consequence. If, and this is going to sound really weird, if, say, squirting Finnegan in the face with water caused him to bite more often in the end, it would be a positive reinforcement. And that's something that I really want to emphasize to you. In operant conditioning, a person's intentions don't matter. The change in behavior is what matters. So I could go up to a student and say, hey, I love your sweater. You look beautiful today in that sweater. I have intentions to try and make that student feel really good by that compliment. But if that compliment causes a student to no longer wear that sweater again for whatever reason, I've actually, with my compliment, punished that student. Because if they don't wear the sweater anymore because of my compliment, it's been a positive punishment. Because they wear the sweater less often, that's the punishment component. The consequence is my compliment, and that was added, so it's a positive punishment. Okay, so one more time, intentions don't matter. How the behavior changes actually matters. And the last thing that I want to say is that there is a reason why I put this information that I'm circling right here with the arrow, there's a reason why I put it in this order. When you are shown an operant conditioning example, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, does the behavior increase or does the behavior decrease? In the end, this is the first step. A lot of people think, oh, the words positive and negative come first, so they try and figure out what these are first. You do this last, okay? So you figure out if it decreases or increases first, if it's a reinforcement or punishment first, and then you decide if you put the word positive or negative into one of these two words, or excuse me, in front of one of these two words second, okay? So your assignment for tomorrow is going to be to complete or practice some of these scenarios that I give you and identify whether or not they are examples of positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment. And you go through and you ask yourself these questions. Is the behavior in the end increase or decrease? What is the consequence? Remember, the consequence is the thing that causes the behavior to change in the end. Is that consequence added or subtracted? Depending on what you decide, you determine whether it's positive or negative. Hopefully this is helpful. Bye.